All right, so thanks everyone and welcome. This is our second year of having this. And so a few quick things that we'll do is let's do this. Can everyone see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So a few quick um, agenda items. Johannes is going to speak first, and then um, Joe and David, then I'll go, and then we're going to kick off the roundtable with something that um, Terry was going to discuss. And presentations, 10 minutes each. If people want to want to ask questions, we can ask questions afterwards, and then that'll leave the majority of the time for us to have the roundtable discussion, the four questions that I sent you, and then an additional one that we'll talk about at the beginning. So just a couple notes to help out, I think, during people's PowerPoint presentations. Let's just go ahead and if you're not speaking, mute your speaker or mute your microphone. And then if you want to speak or ask a question after a presentation, just unmute it. I'll be able to see that on my screen. And so just unmute it and then you can ask your questions. During the roundtable, everyone can just be unmuted if you're going to speak. If you don't plan on speaking, it's fine to mute so we don't have background noise. And then other than that, if there's a delay, I know there was last year a little bit. So if there's a delay, we'll just try to carry on through it. So does that work for everyone? Can everyone hear me? Okay, perfect. Then I will make Johannes the presenter, and you can take it away, Johannes.
Okay. Uh, okay. Can you see my screen? Does it, hello?
Yeah, we can see it.
Can you see my screen? Okay, brilliant.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, there you go. So, well, first of all, thank you for joining us, and thank you to you, Cody, for all your work and efforts to organize this. It's much appreciated, and I really look forward to speaking to all of you. Today, I'm going to present you a few studies from one of our projects which originated in the world of sports with sporting rivalries, but we were looking to transfer our knowledge to, well, a broader context and to general marketing. So we are looking to explore the link between rivalry and distinctiveness. And as you know, both brands and consumers battle out rivalries. Brands get it on via comparative advertising, brand attack adverts, or social media exchanges. And more often than not, consumers take over certain rivalries and battle them out vicariously, like McDonald's and Apple users, and as you all know from the world of sports. So we are looking to investigate rivalries at the brand level and rivalries at the consumer level. And both times the unit of analysis is the individual consumer. Just for the definitions, at the brand level, we look at inter-firm brand rivalry, which is a perception of a special antagonistic relationship between two brands, whether somebody thinks that Apple and Samsung have an intense rivalry. And at the consumer brand rivalry level, we look at mutual competitive comparisons between consumers of a specific brand and of the rival brand's consumers. So this takes into account the element of reciprocity, and I will say a few more things about that. Generally, it captures whether you as an Apple user think that a Samsung user well, reciprocates the rivalry, but I will say more about that later. And in the general marketing literature, we found that both at the inter-firm and at the inter-consumer level, rivalry is very negatively connoted. It has been linked to escalating hostilities and price wars. At the inter-firm level and at the inter-consumer brand rivalry level, we've got all sorts of detrimental outcomes like intergroup stereotyping, schadenfreude, oppositional brand loyalty, less customer-to-customer helping. I guess you know all about that from the world of sports. So all this has been found in a general marketing context as well. And this has actually led leading scholars to propose that brand rivalries are bad. It's better to diffuse rivalries rather than to attack rival brand communities. And that is why most brands stay away from conflict rather than embrace it. However, if branding is all about creating differences, maybe this is a missed opportunity, because we know from sociology that conflict boosts distinction, and actually the concept of distinctiveness is one of marketing's premier objectives. It's a crucial growth factor for brands, and for consumers it's a fundamental human need and a cornerstone of a positive social identity. So that is why in this research we seek to explore and explain the link between rivalry and distinctiveness, and specifically between inter-firm brand rivalry and perceived brand distinctiveness in studies 1 and 2, and studies 3 and 4 then focus on inter-consumer brand rivalry and consumer group distinctiveness. I'll try to put it all in 10 minutes, and let me just very briefly present you our model at inter-firm brand rivalry level. We look at perceived brand distinctiveness, which is the perceived uniqueness of a brand's identity in relation to its competitors. And we propose that inter-firm brand rivalry is positively related to perceived brand distinctiveness, because group lines are drawn more sharply in competition and boundaries are clearly defined in conflict. So this relationship is mediated by clarity of positioning, which captures whether a brand clearly communicates what it stands for and conveys a clear image. And of course, we were having several control variables like brand attitude, familiarity, usage, and involvement, which all have been known to influence brand distinctiveness. So we were controlling for all of them. At the inter-consumer brand rivalry level, we were looking at consumer group distinctiveness as the key dependent variable, and this captures the perceived difference between one's own group and another group. And as you all know from social identity theory, people thrive for positive distinctiveness. It's crucial to be unique and to be positively distinct, and we believe that a strong inter-consumer brand rivalry draws clear lines and sets groups apart. It defines crucial differences and avoids similarity. So that is why we believe there is a positive relationship between inter-consumer brand rivalry and consumer group distinctiveness. And a key feature of our independent variable is the element of reciprocity. You know that most rivalries in sports are not unidirectional, but bidirectional. Best example is always Germany and England. The English think there are rivals, but well, we Germans actually prefer the Dutch to be our chief rivals, so it's unclear really who considers whom a rival, but we believe that reciprocity is key. And you know from social comparison theory that people compare each other all the time, that people size each other up, and unless a rivalry is really reciprocated, it's not a real rivalry, because it's the element of reciprocity that makes rivalries thrive. And this also sets it apart from other concepts like brand hate or brand sabotage or anti-brand communities. So we propose that there is a positive relationship between inter-consumer brand rivalry and consumer group distinctiveness, and this is mediated by rival brand disidentification, because a strong inter-consumer brand rivalry is a very good reason to disidentify from the rivals. And we were controlling for brand identification, which has been well, a key driver of consumer group distinctiveness. Our method, we conducted several studies at both levels. We had 4 studies in total, 2 at the inter-firm level and 2 at the inter-consumer level. And we started with a correlational study, which had 2 samples, like smartphone users or car users, and Nike or Adidas consumers. And then we followed it up with an experiment manipulating the independent variable. We had a total of 1,377 participants, and throughout the studies, good reliability and validity. And although we never rule it out completely, we believe that common method variance is not really a problem. So in study 1, we surveyed smartphone users and I think Nike and Adidas users, and we found a positive total effect of inter-firm brand rivalry on perceived brand distinctiveness, which is 0.12 and 0.16 in the 2 samples, and this was mediated by clarity of positioning, an indirect effect of 0.06 and 0.09. And this was importantly independent of brand usage, brand attitude, and brand familiarity. So the effect would hold even when controlling for these variables. In study 2, we then sought to manipulate the independent variable inter-firm brand rivalry. We were asking participants whether they thought that BMW, the car manufacturer, had an arch rival, yes or no. Those who said yes, BMW does have an arch rival, were placed in the rival condition, and those who said no, I don't think they really have an arch rival, were placed in the no rival condition. And as you can see, people in the rival condition reported significantly higher means of perceived brand distinctiveness, an eta square of 0.04 when controlling for brand attitude and brand usage. So this supports our hypothesis and also the causality of the hypothesis. At the interconsumer level, we had 2 samples in study 3, a smartphone sample and a car sample of car users and smartphone users. And again, we found a positive and significant total effect of interconsumer brand rivalry on consumer group distinctiveness, 0.46 and 0.17. And we also found an indirect effect via rival brand disidentification, 0.08 and 0.11, when controlling for brand identification. And perhaps the most interesting part from a sporting rivalry point of view was study 4, when we manipulated interconsumer brand rivalry. As you know, rivalries are not always reciprocated, so we went to fans of a sports team and told them, we gave them a press article suggesting that your neighbors, they do consider you an arch rival, and they really take you seriously. And those people who got this manipulation, they were placed in the high interconsumer brand rivalry condition, and the other half were placed stated that the neighbors do not actually consider you rivals, they basically ignore you. And people in the high inter-consumer brand rivalry condition reported significantly higher means of consumer group distinctiveness, 4.47 with a 3.94, which makes for an eta square of 0.02. That's not the biggest effect size in the world, but still further proof for the causal relationship between the variables. So summing up, what does this tell us? We believe that rivalry contributes to the development of distinctiveness and helps to accomplish one of marketing's premier objectives. It gives a more balanced view of an emerging phenomenon because past research has focused on the negative consequences of brand rivalries. Specifically, inter-firm brand rivalries give brands a unique and innovative way to position themselves in large markets because the effect of rivalry was independent of brand attitude, brand familiarity, and usage, which is very important. And at the interconsumer brand rivalry, we found that the rivalry does boost consumer identity, and this mechanism is transferred by rival brand disidentification. And interestingly, in the US, the FTC decided to lift the ban on comparative advertising in 1979 to give consumers more information and to also give brands a better way to position themselves. And our findings actually support their decision because this is what happens. It helps brands to carve out a better market position, and it also helps consumers to define themselves. It has a lot of positive consequences for consumers as well. managerial implications or maybe also sporting implications. I think it's very important for sport teams in Europe, where they sometimes are a little bit hesitant to promote rivalries because of violence and escalating hostilities. They should reconsider the element of conflict and establish an us versus them mentality. They should definitely not ignore rivalries, because it looks as if ignoring is the worst things you can do to people these days. It's better to be hated than to be ignored. And when you don't really take seriously a rivalry and your opponent, you won't have the benefits of rivalries. And maybe managers should also reconsider the role of the rival. Are they friends? Are they enemies? Are they friends with benefits? Are they enemies with benefits? This holds at the general marketing level, but also in the world of sports, where it would be an interesting question how rivalries could be promoted. And as you all know, there are positive outcomes and also a lot of negative outcomes. It would be very interesting to balance those two outcomes and see how they compare against each other. If there maybe a study could integrate both the negative and the positive outcomes, it would definitely, allow people to weigh the outcomes. And as you know, whenever you market rivalries, you have to be very careful, because of the thin line, and hostilities can escalate very quickly. With that, I thank you very much for your attention, let's get ready to rumble. I look forward to your questions later in the roundtable. Thank you.
Thanks, Johannes. That was really cool to see. You guys are doing some neat stuff.
Yeah, I hope you don't mind, but I was kind of using the chat function just to make a couple comments that maybe we can come back to later if it's relevant.
Okay, yeah, I'll check them out.
Portion. But yeah, I really enjoyed it.
And I was feeling humbled that we now have to follow that, so good luck to you, Jeff.
That's why you guys are following it, not me. Good job, Johannes. Thank you. All right. I mean, if anyone wants to ask a quick question or so now, go ahead and do it. Or do you want to move on and we can do that in the round table?
I made some notes I'd like to come back to in the round table, but
okay.
Yeah, we can wait till then.
Okay. Then, Joe, I will make you presenter, and then you can take it over.
All right.
Okay. So,
sharing right now here. Okay. All right. So I am going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to use the basis of what I presented or talked about in my Ignite session at SMA, which I think Lamar was at, and maybe a couple of our other viewers. But I'm going to sort of build on it and also share some of the data from that. And then hopefully this will lead to some discussion, because it's really relevant to one of the questions that Cody brought up in relation to what we might talk about in the roundtable. So what David and I are trying to do here, and this is work that we do together, all of you I think know that we do work with kind of our joint project is called No Rivalry, our ongoing research. And we only have college football data right now available up on No Rivalry, but I think in the real near future we'll have all of our pro data available up there. Dave's been working hard on getting that ready to release. So what I want to talk about here is kind of our start at looking at the connections between the antecedents, what contributes to rivalry, and some of the outcomes, right? I'm going to talk mostly about MLS, but I'm going to share some of our initial look at the other leagues beyond MLS. So, you know, we can MLS or soccer here, and what we might say is the new world in North America is, of course, not as well developed as in the old world, specifically Europe, South America, and some other regions. So if we look at some of the other, some of the soccer rivalries around the world, this one being a picture from Old Firm, we can sort of guess at or collect anecdotal evidence as to what some of the contributing factors are. And I know some of you, along with David and I, have done research on this already. But for example, here we've got a rivalry where religion plays a big part, right? Celtic is the Catholic team, Rangers is the Protestant team, and that very much contributes to the rivalry between those two clubs. Oh, screen dropped out.
Yeah, we can see you, but we cannot see your screen.
Let's see if I can fix that somehow.
Cody, is he still the presenter?
He is not for some reason. Let me see.
Yeah,
Are you
Could
trying to
everyone
hijack my presentation, Cody?
Yeah. Could everyone see my screen for a minute?
Yes.
Okay. I was trying to turn on my webcam. All right, Joe, you should be back on. I apologize.
That's okay. No problem. No problem.
Rival sabotage. This is exactly what Johannes warned us.
Exactly. Just getting ready for the round table.
Am I all right here? Oh, no. I need to share again. Okay. There you go. Am I good?
We see your screen, yes.
Okay, great. So, whoops. Let me swap here. There we go. All right. So, we could pull a bunch of rivalries, obviously, from around the world. Another example here, one that I was just recently, within the last year, became familiar with, called the Eternal Derby. Red Star is like the Serbian national team, meaning kind of like the people's team. Partizan is their huge rival. There's lots of violence around this particular rivalry, which is why I sort of pulled it out as an example. Partizan is sort of the armies, thought of as the armies team, or the former Yugoslavian kind of federalist team, if you will. So we've got, point being, some political tensions that underlie this particular one. And that's what we see through across a lot of old world rivalries, if you will. There's some sort of politics or religious element to it, some conflict that then gets taken onto the pitch, right? But when we look at the new world, or MLS specifically, the league's only 20 years old, and already, even before teams have even played, like the New York City FC team, they already had a rivalry kind of formalized with a title being the Hudson rivalry. We see they had some competition here between them and New York Red Bull to light up the Empire State Building. Whichever fans tweeted the most about the rivalry, they were going to light the Empire State Building in that color. You see we've got a couple sponsors associated with it already here, Windows and a realty company in New York, Empire State. And that tends to be what we like to do in the new world, is let's attach a sponsor to it, let's figure out a way to make money and use it to push demand, right? Here are a couple other examples from MLS. Some of you are familiar that they do this rivalry week, which is really meant to push TV ratings. This particular graphic is the one on the left there, is the LA Galaxy against San Jose, and they call it the California Clasico, obviously taking off of the Clasico in Spain between Real Madrid and Barcelona. And then on the right, the Cascadia Cup was a rivalry that exists and was formalized already before some of the teams in the Northwest moved into MLS, specifically the Seattle Sounders and Portland Timbers and Vancouver. And then MLS sort of co-opted that rivalry as well. But the problem with that, kind of formalizing it and using it as a formal marketing tool, as we see here a banner from fans that were sort of upset about MLS sort of co-opting this cup that had existed already, Cascadia. We see the banner there. MLS also created this Trillium Cup between Columbus and Toronto. But if you look at our no rivalry data for MLS, most of our, we use a 100-point rivalry points allocation method that I know most of you are familiar with. If you look at where Columbus fans allocate their rivalry points, Toronto is not even close to their lead rival, almost half their points go to Chicago, and the same thing for Toronto fans, almost half their points go to Montreal. So I think there's this question of both authenticity, you want it to be authentic when you're building a rivalry from a marketing standpoint or from a management standpoint, but at the same time, you don't want it to spill over into violence, right, or into any sort of hostilities that we've seen in the old world. And we've already started to see that here in the new world. Just a couple examples here. This is from the Portland-Seattle rivalry. This qualitative quote from a Seattle fan. Timbers fans are a bunch of heroin abusers, and I left the expletive out. The average Timber fan looks like a homeless teen, right? Another quote, sorry, I got my bar that might be blocking it there. Another quote, this picture looks like the Eternal Derby that I talked about in Serbia, but this is actually from a Chicago Fire game. The quote itself is from Toronto and Montreal, from a Montreal fan. I'd be happy if a bomb dropped on the city of Toronto. I wish their fans nothing but ill will and suffering. So we definitely see some schadenfreude there. The point being that you've already got some of this animosity built into these MLS rivalries, even though the leagues only existed for a relatively short time compared to our other leagues. And so, David and I have done some research. This is from previous research where we really tried to tease out the rivalry dimensions using kind of a mixed method approach, and then we categorized them into 3 dimensions. And the reason that I show this here is because one possibility here is that certain dimensions here, or certain individual factors, perhaps cause more animosity than other factors, and that's what we're trying to really dig into with our latest line of research. So in that past research, we asked fans, what was the most important element to your favorite team's top rivalry, okay? When you ask fans what's the most important, you see this type of a rating, if you will. So frequency of competition comes up high, defining moment, the parity, and you see geography is down on the list a little bit, but when you look at the means, you see there's not a huge difference between means, between numbers 2 and 6, right? So these are all kind of grouped together. But one thing to note, and again, this is from past research where this included not just MLS, there's very few MLS in this particular sample. This was college and pro sports. We asked about 1,000 fans, who was their favorite team and what was that team's biggest rival and how important were these elements. Okay, and you notice cultural similarity, cultural difference, and unfairness are way down toward the bottom, right, in this particular research. When we asked MLS fans the same thing, we get a little bit different rating or ranking of the ratings here. So you see geography moves to the top. Frequency of play is still near the top here. You see not a big difference in the mean rating here. Parity is still important. Defining moments is still important. But you see cultural difference moves up a little bit, right? Again, we're just asking how important is this to your rivalry. You see unfairness is still toward the bottom here. And you'll see in a minute why I've bolded those 2 particular ones. And we looked at a bunch of qualitative quotes, just a couple examples here. So here's a quote from a fan. We see a lot of each other, so fans get sick of each other. So that one being frequency of play, right? It was only once per season, meaning how many times they played. Now it's 3. So again, frequency of play. This third one, we're the closest team and the easiest to travel to away games. So you see geography. And you also see some animosity in this quote. I went to one once, and they chanted that they'd eat my baby. I was not happy about that. So a little humor along with that. Well, potentially humor. Hopefully it's humor. Along with that quote about geography. So here was the MLS ratings, right? So now, changing the question a little bit in terms of our research question, what we're interested in, if we start to look at, okay, what elements lead to the most animosity, here in the 3rd column and the 4th column that I've added, you see a correlation to some schadenfreude measures, and then in the 4th column, a correlation to some relationship discrimination measures. And I'll talk just for a minute about those measures in just a second. But notice what you see here, right, is you see that although cultural difference rated in the middle in terms of the importance, unfairness rated at the end, or at the bottom of our antecedents when it comes to importance, when you look at, how much those measures are correlated with animosity or certain measures of animosity, you see that that's what really matters, right? Here was our measures. A lot of you are familiar with Basilis's measure of Schadenfreude here. This is just an example of one of the items itself. I'm going to just talk about relationship discrimination because you might not be as familiar with that. So this is a series of about 7 items we took from a prejudice scale, or racial prejudice, or nationality prejudice scale, and we just changed them to be related to sports. So we adapted them to be related to sports. Disidentification is just basically a reverse of the Mayo and Ashford scale that a lot of you are familiar with. Prejudice is just sort of prejudging or making a prejudgment of the other team's fans. And you see one of the examples here, the rival team's fans are more obnoxious than fans of the typical team, right? So these were the 4 outcomes that we used for animosity. And again, going back, here because of space, I just showed Schadenfreude and relationship discrimination, but we see kind of the same pattern when we look at this. Again, this is only MLS here. I know this is really small, but I'll give you the quick summary. So here we have more than MLS. We have Major League Baseball, we have Division I football, we have NFL and NHL. We do have NBA data as well. It's just not represented within this graph, but we see the same pattern. And when you look at the correlations between factors, our factors here, competition for personnel, cultural difference, cultural similarity, defining moment, frequency, you can see those kind of across the top, hopefully. But if you look at these bar charts, look at this. Cultural difference is much more correlated across all these leagues compared to the other factors. And we see the same thing over here with unfairness, right? So I think we're starting to see this pattern, or we are definitely starting to see this pattern across multiple sports, right? And it's pretty interesting because when we looked at this previously and we were trying to uncover what these antecedents were and see which ones we could kind of group together using a factor analysis, both of those fell under the same factor that we call bias, right? Or innate bias that you have toward the other team, people that are different from you. Unfairness is if you perceive the league to have preferential treatment toward a particular team, that's what's seen as unfairness. And we see these in some qualitative quotes that I pulled out from the MLS data as well. So I can tell, this first one, I can tell you that my distaste for LA goes well beyond soccer. This is a San Jose fan talking. I find them culturally plastic, materialistic, vapid, shallow, right? From a Montreal fan, extremely proud of French heritage. Toronto loathes our Frenchness. And then, as it relates to unfairness, we had lots of quotes from Timbers fans, Portland Timbers fans, about how the league seemed to favor the Seattle Sounders when they allocated Clint Dempsey back to the Sounders, despite some question as to whether he should have been allocated by a different set of rules that the league uses for players when they come back to the United States to play in the MLS. And then you see a quote also here. This is from a DC United fan talking about New York Red Bulls. The league caters heavily to facilitate the New York Red Bulls' success. So just another example of unfairness. So the last slide here, I don't think I really need to talk much about this given the audience that we have here. We all know why rivalry matters. I just wanted to include it because in what other context can you have merchandise that has a mathematical notation here? Seattle greater than Portland. I mean, that's just fantastic. I just had to end on that with a bunch of academics. So that's it. And thanks again to Cody for hosting, and thanks for all of you for attending and listening.
That's really cool, guys. I like seeing the data from No Rivalry. I like that. That's really cool. I have a couple things to come back to on that during the roundtable. Does anyone else have any?
Joe, while you were talking, Joe, Cody, and I were having a nice little side conversation, so sorry about that.
That's fine. That's fine.
Spark ideas.
That's the point of this, right? Is new ideas, new collaborations, perhaps, whatever works, right? So, yeah, it's fun. I mean, obviously we have a good time doing it, and I know, or I assume all of you do as well.
Yeah, cool. Does anyone, excuse me, does anyone have anything else for Joe or David? All right, I'll go ahead, share mine. We can start on this one. So can everyone see my screen?
Yes, got it.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, perfect. Okay, so it's interesting. Both Johannes and Joe touched on kind of the negative aspects of rivalry, and really what I've found myself doing lately is focusing more on those aspects. And from a marketing perspective, at least in the United States, how can we market things or promote things more responsibly? And the reason that this is important is just as the pictures Joe just showed. If something happens on your property as a sport manager, then you're ultimately responsible for that because you're responsible for your fan safety and making sure they feel safe at a game, making sure they want to come back to a game. And so I spend a lot of time talking to my classes and to other people about, there are legal ramifications from needing to be responsible, but there are also just revenue consequences as well. Someone not wanting to come back to a game because they witness a fight or they have a negative experience or something like that. And so, those of you who saw my presentation at NASM, I'll talk a little bit about it in just a second, but this is kind of a second step into trying to investigate how we evaluate what we see and what we are exposed to. And so in this study, we're interested in looking at the media's influence on rival fan behavior. And this is actually something that I'm doing with a journalism professor at the University of Colorado. And another really interesting thing building off of this is I don't know how many people saw Saturday night. ESPN Game Day already announced they were going to be in Columbus for the Ohio State Michigan game. And the advertisement they saw or they showed on television was pretty much all violence. Now, you can say football is, a violent game. They're going to show hits and things like that. But they also in there showed players pushing and shoving and getting in scuffles and things like that. And so it's just kind of interesting the way that the media portrays these. And so it kind of begs the question, is it the chicken or the egg? Is it the fans who make it negative and so the media gives that to the fans, or do the fans see it from media and so they kind of react that way? So really what we're looking at, and I really don't need to go through this with people. I really wanted to use my time to, this is a study that we're about to collect data on. And so I want to explain it and get some feedback, possibly in the roundtable on maybe some ideas or things that we could do to make it better. So we know what rivalry is. There's multiple um, descriptions of it or definitions of it. And then we also know what causes rivalry, similarities and differences, proximity, prior competition, defining moments. I don't need to go on. The two of the guys who have heavily studied this are in on this forum, and so we all are aware of that. And then some of the outcomes, increased competition output. So, going all the way back to uh, the turn of the century and looking at cyclists and their wanting to try harder or to increase their output when there's another person that they're competing against. There's also, the feelings of joy people get when their rival team loses. back in the 90s, Mahoney and Mormon looked at people's willingness to watch NBA games when their rivals were playing. And so there are a lot of outcomes that have been studied of rivalry as well. And then most recently, Johannes wrote about an increased public collective self-esteem, the in-group distinctiveness, and in-group cohesion as potential outcomes of rivalries and potential positive outcomes of rivalry. Also, just to go further with some of the outcomes, there's information on attendance. People are more likely or want to attend rivalry games. Also, viewership. People are willing to pay more for attendance. They're paying more for attendance and viewership. Uh, Behavioral aspects. This is Sean Pradhan led a team and looking at different ways that people will react when their rival teams either win or lose to someone else, which is pretty interesting. And then cognitively, that's the glory out of reflective failure. And then most recently, we have actually looked at a way to quantitatively measure gorfing, which is pretty cool. And then we can get into a little bit of discussion of that because in another study we did, or another paper we did, we actually compared gorfing and Schadenfreude and kind of found some differences in where they lie and everything, which is pretty neat. And then Mahoney and Howard discussed their fans having similar feelings of joy when a rival team loses than when their favorite team wins. So here's some of the things that we've done as far as what influences rivalry, and I've focused on the work that I've been a part of, the consumption as far as proximity to a team, season ticket holder status, demographic and psychographic, so team identification and gender, they have an influence on rivalry perceptions, and then conference realignment, which I think everyone has seen and we've talked about. This bottom, the promotional rivalries, that is what I presented on at NASM. And David, I had a great conversation afterwards. And so just to recap, we exposed people to one of three titles. University of Memphis students, they were exposed to either the red and blue friendly between Cincinnati and Memphis, the red and blue rivalry, or 481 miles of hate, because that's the approximate distance between the two schools or between the two cities. What we found was we exposed people to these logos and then we measured their rival perceptions using the sport rivalry fan perception scale. And then we also measured their willingness to consider anonymous aggression. What we found was we ended up taking out the data from the red and blue friendly because it's caused some confusion because in the United States, we're not used to having things labeled as friendlies.
Cody,
Yeah.
Sorry, can you go back? You said what you found? You froze for a second there.
Oh, okay. So what we did or what we found was we ended up taking out the red and blue friendly because that caused some confusion for people. But what we found was students that were exposed to the negative logo, so 481 miles of hate, they were more negative toward their rival and more likely to consider anonymous aggression than people that were exposed to the neutral title or the red and blue rivalry. And that makes sense. This is just empirical information that we found to support that. But what's important with this is it's one step in telling practitioners what they should be doing to promote a rivalry, to get people excited, but also to protect themselves against anything happening at their events. Or I should say, if something happens at their event, they are less complicit in it. I mean, we've all seen the skits that NBA teams run where they have someone dressed up in a rival shirt and then the mascot comes down and sprays silly string in the person's face and everyone laughs. And you know those things are fun and they're good natured. But if something were to happen, then it's difficult for that organization to say, we had nothing to do with that. We don't condone this behavior, because in fact, it seems like they do by having those type of skits. And so that this is really the first step in showing administrators what you can do. And so what we're trying to do now is we're really trying to look at how media headlines and storylines influence fans. And so that's their rival perceptions and their behavior toward the rival, and behavior or reactions when a rival team loses to someone else. And so this is another experimental design similar to the promotional titles, but one group is going to be exposed to a positive media headline and story. And as you can see, these stories are supposed to be short, so they can be read in under 30 seconds, because as you know, if you can't keep the public's interest for too long, now with in the age of social media, your message is going to be lost. So the first group will see a positive media headline and story, and it'll be a story about a joint food drive leading up to a rivalry game. So for instance, if Ole Miss and Mississippi State are playing the week before their game, the team's fan base is coming together and having a competition over who can donate the most food to a food bank. Group 2 will be exposed to a neutral media headline and story. So that'll just be a straight preview of a rivalry game, much like you would see on an ESPN or Fox Sports or anything like that. And then the third group will be exposed to a negative media headline and story. And that will be a short story about a fan fight leading up to the rivalry game. And so what we are expecting to see, or really hoping to see from this for a practitioner, is people exposed to the positive headline and story react or are less negative toward their rival than people who are exposed to the negative headline and story. And then people exposed to the positive story are less likely to be aggressive toward the rival team. They're less likely to just take joy when that rival team loses. If we can see that, then we can really start to point to what practitioners can do, aside from just providing those promotional titles. Because remember, with those promotional titles, a lot of teams have existing rivalries, and they have names like battle or war or hate built into those title name or those rivalry names. There's not a lot they can do about changing the logo. If they change the logo, they're probably going to get backlash from fans about the rebranding. And so this will help administrators hopefully at least case their rivalry in a positive way. And the biggest take from this hopefully would be to stage some kind of joint socially responsible activity between rival teams, as a lot of teams do now, but also making sure that gets media coverage and the type of media coverage that organizations want. And so what our instrument is, we're measuring team identification, and we're using that as a possible covariate to see just to control for that. We also ask favorite team and rival team consumption questions to see if that's going to impact how people react. And then next in the survey, people are going to be exposed to one of the 3 headlines or stories. After they're exposed to that, then they're going to be asked some questions about what the story was about. Was it positive, neutral, or negative? Just so we can check to make sure people are evaluating it the way and interpreting it the way we intend them to. Then they'll be asked their rival perceptions with the SRFPS. And one neat thing that we've done with a paper that's actually still in review now is we have taken the SRFPS to the professional level and some in the international ranks, and actually validated that. So now we can open this study and we can open our area of investigation up to fans beyond just the collegiate level. Then we'll ask people's likelihood to commit anonymous aggression, which is tripping a participant, hurting a participant on the rival team. How likely are they going to be aggressive toward that rival participant if they won't get into trouble? And then finally, we're going to ask their reactions to rival failure. And so we're going to ask both questions that came from Delacus and Melancon on Schadenfreude, and then the latest Gloriata reflective failure questions that we validated. Now, kind of wrapping this up, why do we want to study this? We want to gain information on how the public and how fans are influenced by media and influenced by what we see. And hopefully we can shed some light or just gain some understanding on that question I asked at the beginning of the presentation. Is it fans are negative toward rival teams, so media gives them that negativity and feeds it? Or does the media really show that, and so fans kind of feed off of that? Also looking at how fans evaluate messages, just a second step in looking at how they're going to evaluate media messages, not only promotional messages. And then hopefully some lessons for managers on how to responsibly promote rivalries. As I said, if a person who's exposed to the positive story is less negative toward their rival and less likely to commit some of those aggressive behaviors, less likely to just experience pure joy when that rival team loses to someone else, then the hope would be practitioners could start to stage some of those events and start to make sure that they have the media coverage that they should. Because one really interesting thing that Johannes talked about was people not being afraid to promote a rivalry. And I definitely agree with that. We all agree that you want to promote, you want people excited. At the same time, if something happens, we don't want to be responsible for really promoting that violence. And so hopefully this is the second step in what we're trying to do to kind of show this overall impact that media messages and titles and promotion have on fan behavior. And so that's it for me. I'll open it up real quick, and if anyone has any questions or kind of comments on some things you think we might could do, they're greatly appreciated. So,
hey Cody, can I ask you to go to the slide about the instrument real quick? I just don't want to forget to mention this.
Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think I really like this setup. I think one thing that you might think about is right after you provide I would provide perhaps the headline first before you show the story, and ask the respondent how likely they are to proceed to read the story given the headline. And then give them the story. Like no matter what, no matter how they answer that. Now, here's the reason why, because it's exactly what I think you were talking about at the end there in terms of the teams and the media outlet want to promote the rivalry, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the media outlet in particular is not really that concerned, most likely, about if fights break out or not. That's more the team's concern, right? I mean, we'd like to think we're all concerned, but we know the truth.
Yeah.
Media cares about ratings and not much else. So I think that additional step could give you some really interesting additional contribution in terms of, in an ideal world, yes, the positive story reduces violence, but the positive story also gets the same number of people wanting to read it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because then if a practitioner says, well, yeah, I understand that it could lead to more animosity, but I'm going to go with the controversial, story because it's going to generate more ratings, you can go back to that question and say, no, actually our data shows it's not going to get more reads. So you kind of take away that argument, if you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. That's an excellent point. we actually, in doing something else, and trying to compare language about sport rivalries and language about this recent presidential election, which is that data is amazing.
We're going to need a few more hours. I think.
Yeah, we've actually, in looking at that, come across some things that it is, if the way that we feel about the out group dictates how we're going to consume anything. And so if I see something about my out group that's negative and I have a negative perception of the out group, well, then I want to read that because
Right.
I want it to validate my feelings or my belief.
Your confirmation bias.
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah, exactly.
And so,
Cody,
yeah, I think that's an excellent point to add that. Thank you.
I have a similar comment, but do you want me to hold off until after Lamar and bring it up to you later in the roundtable? Or do you want to talk about it now?
It's up to you.
Let's hold off,
Okay.
just because I don't want to take time from Lamar. So, but I made a note to come back to it with an idea on that. So,
Okay.
thank you, Cody.
Yeah, thank
It's
you
interesting
guys.
stuff.
So, next, what Terry, Lamar, and I had talked about is this kind of starts off the roundtable in a way. I'll introduce it. I'll let Terry and Lamar discuss it more if they want, and then just kind of open it up to everybody. But this idea of there's a lot of research on team rivalry. There's not as much on individual rivalry. So between individual players or individual coaches, and that could exist in both the team setting. So Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, or in individual sports. And so I what they want to talk about is kind of a conceptual way to look at that. And the last thing I'll say on it is I think it's really interesting, especially for promotional sports. Like boxing or MMA or something like that. And Lamar and I have talked about that before. Sports that thrive or actually drive off of the promotion of it. And so I'll turn it over to you guys. And do you want me to make you presenter so you can show anything, or do you just want to talk?
I mean, I was just going to talk, Cody. Lamar, did you have anything that you wanted to put up there?
No, I was just going to talk also.
Okay.
Okay. So this kind of just came out of some discussions that Lamar and I were having, obviously within his wheelhouse of UFC. But it kind of got to be a bit more broad than that in terms of looking at, how I think before we even get to the rivalry aspect, we kind of have to think about how that fan group surrounding an individual athlete, how that community kind of comes together, and does it look the same as a group of fans associated with a particular team? Because obviously, teams are relatively forever, whereas athletes, unless you're talking golf where you maybe have 20 years of a person being relevant and competitive, but in certainly most other sports, you're looking at a window that is much smaller than that. So we were wondering if perhaps we need to be not only looking at rivalry differently when the focus of that social group is a single person instead of a team and the players and the coaches and all the people that make up that social group, if it's somehow different. And I think one thing that we saw when we were doing some not rivalry research, but just some stuff on UFC and sponsorship, that we use the points of attachment index, and like many people in this area, adapted a team-based measure to fit specific athletes, in that case UFC fighters. And without going into too much detail, statistically the ID portion of that related to the athlete was a little bit problematic. So if you look across the literature on individual sports, and certainly over into the endorsement literature, again, I'm more of a sponsorship person myself, if you look over there, I mean, you see various measures of liking. There's some kind of self-brand image stuff, and whether or not your desired image, aligns with that of the athlete that you like, and vice versa. And also, you have the Q-score people and what they do in terms of liking and so on. But if you look across all of the measures, at least that I'm familiar with, and you try to adapt them to an individual sports setting, I don't know that we're necessarily capturing that connection between fans that may or may not be there. I mean, maybe it is the same, but I don't think we necessarily have an answer, to that question. Lamar, was there anything else you wanted to jump in there on that before I kind of get to my last part?
No, not yet. You've got it well covered so far.
All right, so, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves because I know the first discussion question is context, but I think that this kind of is part of where we're thinking about this being different is, I wonder, and this is more of a proposition, I wonder if competitive balance in individual sports actually disrupts rivalry. And I mean competitive balance, across the entire, level of golf or what have you, across all PGA players. Because if you think about, for example, we're kind of in a golden age of, I would say, of tennis rivalry right now, where you've got, Djokovic, Federer, well, Federer on his way down, but Djokovic, Nadal, and you could argue Murray in there, that are pretty much dominating the scene, and therefore they, some combination of those two play each other in just about every Grand Slam final. If you go back a few years when the level of tennis was lower and more competitively balanced, Federer was so far ahead of everybody on his own, kind of like Tiger Woods in golf, that during that time until Nadal came around, there was really no one to really make a rivalry with him. So, go back to golf in the 60s with the tripod of player Nicklaus and Palmer. Do we have to have this subgroup that's so far ahead of everybody else at the top in order for rivalries to really matter in individual sports? I can't think of any rivalries that anyone really talks about in any of those sports that are between, less than the premier athletes, whereas, we have rivalry, we have Harvard and Yale and Pitt and West Virginia years ago when they weren't necessarily good. Everybody in team sports has a rival, but does that exist the same way across all levels of competition in individual sports, or do we have to have that level of success or what have you, in individual sports as an antecedent for a rivalry to exist? So those were just some thoughts that I had about, why the context between individual sports might matter, and, context being the next question, but also are we even measuring ID properly, or do we need new measures for ID with a particular athlete, and then does that connection look different if I'm a big fan of Phil Mickelson as opposed to, West Virginia football? I was trying to get my head out of the way of my towel back there. So, do we look different in terms of how we connect to some of these different team versus individual? I know if you look at the multi-dimensional scales that are out there for ID, they all have athlete in them, but it's all athlete within the team, whether it's trail stuff further back or Bob Here's stuff. There's lots of stuff about athletes and coaches, those are subscales, but they're just entities within the team, and I don't think, just adapting those subscales to an individual sport necessarily is doing it. Lamar, that was about everything I had that I wanted to throw out there for anyone to agree or disagree with. Lamar, did you have anything else to add? that I forgot from our discussions?
Not really. Just the bigger thing being in terms of the in-group and out-group, in terms of social identity theory, and what is the premise of much of the rivalry research here, is that do those groups, as you mentioned previously, do they look the same for fans of individual athletes, or are they more temporal? Are they less likely to continue on as fans of the sport, or are they more likely? So, does rivalry take on the same dimensions in individual sports as it does in team sports, or are we looking at fans of a sport first, and then the fan of the individual athlete happens to come next? So I think that these are all potential areas for future research, and something that, again, Terry and I had talked about before, in terms of looking at a little bit more closely.
And one thing that we also kind of discussed that I forgot to mention, going back to what Cody said about looking at rivalries between individual athletes outside the fan side, do we have to have that first? If Nadal and Djokovic are clearly buddies and they never say anything bad about each other, then are we ever going to have a rivalry between the fan groups associated with them? Whereas, teams, again, just being a different entity, we can always kind of pit them against one another, and players and team dynamics are always changing. But when you have that single personal identity, that if the two athletes themselves seem to get along fine, then are the fans ever going to really, pit themselves against one another like we see in team sports? I don't know.
I think
anyway, sorry, Lamar, go ahead.
In terms of something that Cody had mentioned and that he and I had talked about before, is just this idea of the manufacturing of rivalries, especially in individual sports, where if we're really attempting to drive viewership for a boxing or a UFC pay-per-view event, then and you don't have the in many cases the geographic proximity that's something of interest in team sports, and you also really want to drive viewership. You want to drive these ratings. Perhaps there isn't this overarching concern as in team sports that we may have, where fans are going to behave in a deviant manner and get in fights and so forth. We really want to drive viewership. So is there just this inherent interest to manufacture this rivalry and perhaps breed intensity and or animosity between these competitors, even if it doesn't actually exist? I know that in some cases in the combat sports that there's been great promotional buildup associated with some of the events, and yet afterwards fans have taken pictures of fighters or competitors hanging out, having a beer together, when in actuality they were friends all along, but promotionally they needed to engage in these behaviors to present animosity, so to further generate interest in the card itself or in the main event. So I think that again, those are all interesting aspects associated with promotions of rivalry, and then also some of the outcomes associated with rivalries in individual sports.
And I think I was just looking back through the comments as Lamar was speaking, and this might be a good place for us to open it up to discussion. Just to clarify for David, my comment about rivalry, I would agree that some of the ones that you're discussing look more like rivalries. If you just look at the numbers in terms of the repeated competition aspect, the people who've played each other the most and in the most finals are, the four now that I mentioned, but again, is that because they're so much better than everybody else, and that they always, end up in finals, whereas if you look back then, it was, much more spread around. But I would agree that those relationships looked more like rivalries than what we see between, Djoko, Federer, Murray, and Nadal. So, in terms of the fact that we're getting a lot of data points between these tennis players right now, that was more so what I meant by that, as opposed to does it look like a rivalry or feel like a rivalry to us when these guys play each other?
So you're putting a lot of emphasis on that definition of rivalry as the competition, like having those frequency of competition opportunities. Is what you're saying.
Not necessarily in general, but in this, for
Okay.
the purpose of this one point, that's more so what I was getting at. Yeah.
And
Thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah, and I can't really speak to tennis. That's not my area. I just got a little sidetracked. Sorry.
No, it's all right. I'm not a tennis person either. I just, those things look like rivalries. It's just now we have all this repeated competition, which we know from the literature, repeated competition tends to drive rivalry forward. But I'm not sure that we're necessarily getting that, even though these permutations between these four tennis players, they're all, you can look it up easily. I did it the other day. I don't have the numbers put together that I could flash up, but between those four, like the top 10 tennis repeated competition overall in all matches and in Grand Slams, between the permutations of those four guys are pretty much like the top 10 most frequent matchups in tennis history. And then there's a couple of others mixed in. There's a list out there you can look up quickly.
Hey, Terry, did you see anything on Everett Navratilova? Because what's really interesting about them is, like, they're seeing like 70s and 80s as this huge rivalry, but there was something else going on too with United States, USSR, and so it was like they represented like the Cold War or something. And so the reason I ask is maybe there is, I don't know, maybe there's something that needs to be perceived to be going on between the players, either personally or on an individual level or on a larger group level. Did you see anything on those as far as what they did?
No, I mean I didn't look anything into that. I know that was kind of a sub theme to that rivalry, and that kind of brings up the context aspect again, that in these more international global sports, do these individual athletes represent their countries in tennis or in golf the same way as we see maybe international soccer or hockey or some of those sports that do a little more international competition. I know that I find it interesting, like the connection is obviously there. I don't think we need to argue that, but I think about a friend of mine who I think she might be first generation American. Her family is from Serbia, and they immigrated to the U.S. and her aunt and her 60-year-old aunt and 90-year-old grandmother, they live and die by Djokovic. I mean, and it's almost like a connection, to the old country where they came from, I think. So, I don't know if that's necessarily a thing or not across, but maybe in specific situations like the one you were talking about, that from our country, and that nationalistic stuff comes through the same way as with a team. I kind of suspect in general it doesn't, but in maybe specific situations like Everett Navratilova, maybe it does.
I think this is like right on with my class. I should cut out this discussion and make my class watch it. So, because we actually just covered Everett Navratilova and the underpinnings of the Cold War that played into that rivalry. I think this is a great question. So my project in the class, I make the students choose two different rivalries, one domestic, one non-domestic, and then compare and contrast them. All the questions are formulated around learning objectives relevant to teams, but I get students that want to pick individual rivalries. So Terry and Lamar, this is like right down of problem that I recognize in the class when students pick individual rivalries, because they're trying to answer these questions that are based on a team, right? And some of it translates, but some of it maybe doesn't translate as much. So in terms of what I've seen that translates, at least in the projects and in grading them and thinking about this a little bit, is this idea of the cultural difference, you know, and that's what we're talking about with Everett and Navratilova, right, is you've got this very distinct cultural difference. And the interesting thing about that rivalry is, while there was animosity in the middle of the rivalry, at the beginning and the end of the rivalry, they were really good friends. I mean, they were doubles partners, you know. But yet the media, here it comes into the media, right? The media created this storyline of, oh, one's from, you know, a Cold War, or one's from the West, one's from the East, you know, one's from the USSR-aligned nations, and one's from, obviously, the USA. Even though Navratilova defected to the U.S., it pretty much, you know, agreed with the Western philosophy in doing so when she was like 17, you know. So the media just created this, even though I'm not sure it really existed. So that could be kind of an example of some of these things where I'm not sure she was a willing participant in the media narrative, but just because of what was going on in the background, it worked. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I think you've got these examples of like Agassi-Sampras somewhat, where part of what made that rivalry work was they were both from the U.S., right? So you had similarity in that regard. You had difference in terms of their personalities, certainly. But look at the Williams sisters. I mean, that rivalry worked because they were as similar as you could possibly be, right? So I think where you get into this gray area and where it doesn't work as well, apart from frequency of competition, because I think you're definitely onto something there, but is where you don't have a lot of similarity between the players, but you don't have like this stark Cold War difference either, you know? So it's just kind of in between. There's like a little bit of similarity, there's a little bit of difference, there doesn't seem to be that much animosity. That's where you have a difficult time. I mean, individual animosity between the players. That's where I think as a marketer you run into this situation where it's hard to concoct something to get the fans into the rivalry, if you will. Unless you have extreme frequency of play.
And that's getting back to Johannes' stuff about distinctiveness. It comes right in there. And the Jetton research and getting, you know, that optimal curve of not too similar but not too.
And just going back through the comments again, I see Johannes said here something about, however, the current tennis players all seem like nice blokes. I wonder that as, you know, think about what professional athletes, you know, interactions between, you know, Magic Bird and throw Jordan in there as well, which is kind of the classic case study of guys, you know, pushing each other and disliking each other, but then, you know, having a positive relationship after. But if you look at, you know, look between today's golfers, you know, Palmer, Nicklaus, Player, you probably had a bit of the same thing. But if you look at golfers today, if you go through Rory and Spieth and Johnson and the, you know, the 4 or 5 young guys all in that in that top group, none of them really seem to dislike each other, and they really support each other. And, you know, the Patrick Reed, Rory McIlroy Ryder Cup match aside, you know, they never seem to get in any conflict with each other. So I wonder, is that just a shift that we're seeing in individual sports, that it's much more of a community and nobody really at the top dislikes each other anymore? I don't know. Does anyone have a counterexample or two to that? Yeah, maybe NASCAR, as Craig mentions. NASCAR, I think, would be maybe a counterexample where we still see guys that appear to genuinely dislike each other. But I don't know, golf, tennis, even UFC, do we have too many examples? You know, after Phil and Tiger, obviously they didn't like each other, but it didn't matter because Tiger blew him into the water. Sorry?
You guys mentioned boxing a bit in your presentation. What about, are there boxing relationships that you have the true animosity?
It'd be hard to identify one that everyone would recognize at the top level.
Well, what about Tyson Holyfield?
Well, at the time, certainly, right? I mean, certainly at the time, those two guys hated each other. Tyson was considered to be this social deviant,
Yeah.
Bizarre. And at the time, Holyfield had created this image for himself as a man of God. So we certainly had some contrasting images there. And I think that at the time they did strongly dislike each other. And now, obviously, years after the fact, they're making their rounds on Oprah, Lifetime TV, and other outlets, doing interviews together and so forth.
So, for you guys, can you fill me in? I haven't done research on individual sport athletes. We all know social identity theory. What stuff from social identity theory holds when we're talking about fans of individual athletes, and what stuff doesn't hold?
I mean, in the bit of stuff I've done, I don't think we know, and that's kind of what I'm wondering here, is what carries over and what doesn't when the central focus of the in-group is person versus an entity. I don't know, Lamar, have you seen, having done more of this stuff than I have?
No, I haven't really used, a lot of social identity in terms of framing, any of the stuff that I've done. But I think it really kind of goes back to what you mentioned a little while ago, and not having that central entity, as in the case of a team, and how that might be different in terms of identifying the in-group and the out-group. I think that for fans of individual sports or individual athletes specifically, it's likely going to be much more difficult to label, identify, to associate with that in-group that we would refer to under social identity theory. And similarly, identifying, labeling, coming into contact with the out-group of the opposing individual athletes. So I think it really does kind of provide an avenue for some future research in terms of looking at this more closely.
Yeah, I think it's an issue, again, like I mentioned before, of this, the question of time and relevance. When we look at, I mean, if someone has some examples to the contrary, it'd be interesting to talk about. But, think about social identity and where that's used, sports teams, politics and religion and all these other, those things are kind of enduring and they're more or less around forever. Whereas, this single athlete situation, like I said, we've got maybe a decent decade for, in most cases, where that connection is made and then sort of lost. The connection is still there, but without the competition, do we really care at this point if Magic like each other, which they do, or don't, because they're, sitting on their bags of money and just, enjoying life. So there's nothing there for us to align ourselves with and to, go back and forth without the competition. So I even wonder, it's making me wonder if social identity, as we typically use it in sport, if it really even fits.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering too. And for me, the way Joe and I conceptualize Rivalry is so much around social identity. Well, if that doesn't apply to individual sports, that raises questions of using that lens at all. When looking at these Rivalry, or not at all, but there's a lot more there if we're looking at Rivalry in individual sports. It's a great question, and I haven't thought about that yet and haven't done any research, so I'm excited that you guys are doing it.
I mean, I think too that two aspects of the individual athletes that the fans are going to be identifying with is similar to like the work that you guys have done all on the board here, but using like academic prestige in terms of intercollegiate athletics and just in individual sports, fans attaching to the performances of these athletes. So perhaps that comes in the form of winning percentages and or image, etc. And I think that's, if I had to hypothesize, that's largely going to be an influential factor here in terms of how these fans are identifying, their personal fandom and also the relevant in-group and also out-groups.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely still elements of it there, that it's still an intergroup conflict of some sort. I just think that the connection must somehow be different. And I didn't want to get too much into context stuff, but Craig mentions it here in the comments that I wonder if there are social aspects or demographic aspects on the fan side that have some sort of relevance here. He mentions with golf and tennis versus boxing and NASCAR, maybe throw UFC in that latter group as well. There could be some differences there as well, but I just think it comes back somehow to how we conceptualize and how we need to maybe change the lens slightly, to use David's terminology, for how we look at these connections first, and then how we look at between the groups in a rivalry setting.
The other thing, and Joe, you could probably speak to this. I'm sure you can speak to this better than I can, but Formula One might be an interesting place to look because you have these prominent individual athletes and kind of a team connection as well. NASCAR, they have, as I understand it, a little less of a team focus than you would find in Formula One, but it might be an interesting place to look at that overlap. Plus, you get the difference. They're all from different countries, all over the world. They compete, so could be a context to look into more.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. Of course, I'm always thinking about Formula One, so when someone else brings it up, I'm excited. Yeah, I mean, you definitely have, in that context, you have team affiliations. Like my affiliation as a fan is much more toward one of the teams, the Williams team. But many fans, it's the particular driver. And I think it's a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of, the identification or points of attachment might be different, individual versus team. I know a lot of the drivers, it's nationality, which also plays into the team. But and I think there's some other elements, maybe social / demographic with individual athletes, like just age, race, life stage, maybe, right? So when I hear the athlete stories and I find out that they have 3 kids and they're about the same age as me, and they grew up in the Midwest or have some sort of similar background to me, automatically I can identify with them perhaps a little bit more than I used to. The selection thing that's going on, right? When certain athletes or coaches speak out, if they hold similar views to me, all of a sudden I'm like, oh, yeah, I'd like to, I'm going to follow that person a little bit more now, or pay more attention at least to the news surrounding that athlete or coach, because I can identify with some aspect of them or their character.
Yeah, I think that I was just trying to pull a source here real quickly to see if I could find an exact measure, but from the endorsement literature, there's a study, is an older one, I believe, from Choi and Rafan, that they look at self-concept amongst fans and whether the endorser, represents their ideal self-image. So, do we select these people based on characteristics that, whether we have them or not personally, we would like to see in ourselves, and is that something that attracts us to them? And of course, that's an endorsement looking at purchase intention ultimately. But I wonder if that's part of the missing link, that these are people we aspire to be like in some way. That's where the connection is drawn from, more than the points of attachment that we see for team sports. If that might be the start of one of your sub factors of athlete points of attachment.
Yeah. So just to keep us on track, I enjoy conversation like this because it's great, and it kind of took care of our first roundtable topic anyway. So just to try to make sure we have time. No, that was good. Just should try to make sure we have time. Go ahead. I shared my screen, so if people don't have the question in front of them, the question is on the screen if you can see it. Our second roundtable topic is: should researchers be more concerned with understanding antecedents to sport rivalry or outcomes of sport rivalry? And I think really what I mean by this question is not is one more important than the other, but kind of how do they match, or how do they meet together? So both are extremely important, because one, we can understand what causes a person to feel a certain way. The other, we obviously can see, because a person is feeling this certain way, they're more likely to do these things. And so that's kind of what, just to clarify on the question. And I added this because I know I knew Joe and David were talking about some of the antecedents, and I was talking about some of the outcomes, and so I wanted to get some pretty good discussion on it. So take it away.
I think in the end we care about outcomes. We're all very interested in human behavior, and we want to know how rivalry is impacting consumers or society as a whole. We care about antecedents as a way of knowing, understanding what's causing these rivalries or whatever it is we're looking at. But in the end, it's all part of understanding that human behavior. At least that's the way I see it. Maybe you see it otherwise, but it's all part of building that knowledge to understand where we're going to end up.
Yeah, I think, well, one of the other keys to the antecedents too is just the marketing aspect to it, right? So, you have, obviously with a new team, but even teams that change leagues, right? Or change divisions or what have you, we care about the antecedents from a marketing standpoint. But I think, certainly several of us have dabbled in, or all of us have dabbled in, the consequences a little bit. I would suggest, at least my initial impression is, and that maybe you guys don't share this, but that we've done quite a bit of research already, and certainly we could do more on the antecedents, but I see that as being more developed amongst what's been published, at least, than what we have developed on the consequence side. I think on the antecedent side, there's still work to be done in terms of parsing out some of the antecedents. In just talking about my own research with David, I think cultural difference, we use that, but man, that's almost too wide of a factor, right? There could be 10 different things within cultural difference. So, I think we could, we need to do some more work in that regard, maybe to be a little bit more specific than that catch-all. But, and also I think that they work together. There's a correlation, and we've started to look at this, but obviously between cultural similarity and geography, right? So how some of these antecedents might work together in fans' minds, I think. But on the consequence side, we've identified some of them, but I think there's much more gray area that we could make progress in there.
And Cody, a lot of your stuff has focused more on that side of it, where you're looking at, how likely are spectators to have aggression, or how likely are they to, what was the one you presented at SMQ down in Atlanta? I remember was very outcome based.
Atlanta. Let's see. Well, we did some aggression stuff in that too, I think.
There was something with consumption as
I have to go
well
back.
in there.
Yeah, we have done some stuff with how likely is a person to consume their favorite team. So go to games, watch on TV when they're playing the rival. The stuff we're doing now that we're currently working on, some of it's in review, is when the rival team loses to someone else, are you, as a fan, then likely to present themselves as a fan of their favorite team? So wear shirts of their favorite team, merchandise of their favorite team. Are they likely to talk to other people about it? And so that's some of the stuff that we're doing right now, and trying to find what some of those outcomes are. I want to, Joe, I want to ask a question that David touched on it while you were presenting, but I've always been interested in that, the unfairness in rivalry and how that contributes to rivalry. And I mean, David and I were talking about, I imagine that's probably the team, or not, I'm sorry, it goes in unfairness and the dominance. Probably the team that's being dominated feels like the other team's being unfair. But where did that characteristic really come from?
So that was, and David, you can jump in if I misdescribe this. Is that even a word? Anyway, so that all of those elements, and that one is included in this, came from like the qualitative data when we did all these interviews, and the relative dominance. Well, I mean, you were exactly right. I looked back through the comments after I had presented the chat comments, and I mean, you guys were spot on, and Cody, you were bringing this up. Like, it's the team that's being dominated, right? So although we've talked about, all of us kind of have talked about at different times, the element of reciprocity, right? But even if the rival doesn't reciprocate, it doesn't mean that I still don't see it as a rivalry, right? So the example that we point to a lot, because it shows up in our data as being one-sided, is Boston College and Notre Dame. So just because Notre Dame doesn't view Boston College as that much of a rival, to Boston College fans, this is a huge rivalry, with Notre Dame. And I think that there is a relationship with unfairness, although I'd have to look it up. I'm sure I've run that correlation before. I could probably pull it up here in just a minute. But I think the unfairness is more of like or what we've found is, it tends to be more of a league issue, where, for instance, the Patriots are a great recent example in the NFL, right? So the Patriots seem to be cheating, or at least there's some implication of them cheating, and some fans think that the NFL is letting them get away with it. Other fans, think that they're not. And so some fans who think that they're getting away with it without proper punishment, see it as unfair, and that raises the animosity and also the rivalry somewhat with their own team, wanting to beat the Patriots because the Patriots are getting preferential treatment, and you saw some of those quotes. So there's a great example in Formula One too, and it's not even questionable in Formula One. I mean, the governing body favors Ferrari. Ferrari gets more money in the revenue distribution than any other team, and it's no secret. Everybody knows it. But it makes all the other teams want to beat Ferrari for that reason. Does that answer your question, Cody?
Yeah, it does. I think, and it's something similar to what we found, is that a team that loses the last time two teams play, they're more negative. And that's not very surprising. The thing that's really interesting to me is that the team, if the team that loses is more negative, well, that means the team that wins, what's going on with them? And is it that they just kind of, for the 10 months or 12 months until they play the team again, do they just kind of leave them behind? That it's like, well, we talk about it like in football that you play one time a year. We talk about bragging rights for a year. Was it really bragging rights? Or is it, hey, we won, we're better, so we don't need to talk about them. They're not worth talking about for the next 12 months, which in itself, I believe, is a way of derogating the rival, that you're not even worth talking about. I'm not going to waste my time on you. And so kind of, is it like this indifference on, or is it, I should say, is it the losing team wanting to win and wanting to like take back their pride or get their pride back, or is it the winning team just like pushing away and being indifferent? That's why I thought that was really interesting.
Johannes, he said in his presentation, it's better to be hated than ignored, right? Which is a great quote. Yeah, I think that should be the title of this next paper.
Hey, Cody, just kind of going back to your question here, I think that we do need to look more closely at the relationships between these antecedents and various outcomes. So not just obviously solely the negative outcomes either associated with rivalry and deviant fan behavior, but also, favorable outcomes as it relates to, attendance or mediated viewership or article reads, mentions online, et cetera, because as Joe mentioned, from a marketer's perspective, we really do need those details to be able to tease out how we can put together effective marketing strategies to drive interest, especially in cases where, as you mentioned, teams are shifting conferences, they're facing new opponents, with greater frequency than they had been in years past, or even in the case of, individual sports, which of these antecedents to rivalry are generating the consumer interest, which is ultimately what, all sport marketers are interested in terms of that, ultimate consumer behavior is attendance and watching on TV.
And
so
I had the same thoughts during Joe's thing. What Joe was saying about marketing, because I don't know if anyone has done any work on this, but it doesn't seem to me that marketers are generally able to manufacture a rivalry. We sitting here at the University of Arkansas, I do this with my students, ask them, who's our rival? LSU. Does LSU see us as their rival even though we have a branded game? Probably not. Are we rivals with the University of Missouri? No, we don't care about them. But, the SEC, the conference, and the schools, now that we're playing Missouri on Thanksgiving and so on every year, because of the fact that, Arkansas has been the SEC for 20 years or 25 years and still doesn't really have a rival, trying to push this Missouri thing, but, is it just enough to say, well, we're bordering states, we're going to play on Thanksgiving, which, has the history of being a time for rivalry games, and then just sit back and wait 20 years or 25 years for the thing to develop? Like, is that really the best we can do to influence people to believing that this is important? As joining the SEC has not been effective, at least in my anecdotal stuff. I haven't really studied it, but just looking at the way that the game is poorly attended, being on Thanksgiving typically. So I think understanding those antecedents and maybe understanding more of them and how they relate to marketing and whether marketers can start to develop best practices for, I hate using the term manufacturing, but can we build? Are there things that we can do to build a rivalry to then get those favorable outcomes that Joe and Lamar and everybody else talked about? That's the thing that I would like to see if we can figure out, because and if someone has a counterexample, I'd love to hear it. I don't think anyone's really been able to be really successful at that so far.
I look to the Battle of the Bricks as what all rivalries should aspire to be.
Let me see if I can find some memorabilia here. I might have some. Sure. That's Ohio and Miami, by the way. Miami, Ohio.
So, Cody, I wanted to go back to what you remember after your presentation. Joe had some comments. Lamar, you just made some comments that relate here, so I want to revisit it. You know, Cody, you talked about important things about responsible marketing and making sure that marketers are positioning these rivalries and playing up these rivalries in a way that's still keeping a safe consumption environment. However, what effect does that have in terms of fan interest and caring and consumption? If you make them so neutral, do you lose the marketing potency of rivalry? And I'm wondering, with your research, if you'd be able to add in, you know, you're collecting likelihood to commit aggression under these three different categories. Could you collect likelihood to consume as well and do a comparison with the other groups? So here's your likelihood to consume, or your self-reported likelihood to consume when you see the 481 miles of hate versus when you see you know, the red and blue shootout or whatever it was.
Yeah, and I could definitely start. I could definitely add likelihood to consume. I think that's a great idea, is to look at those positive outcomes of it, because that's what marketers want.
Yeah, because even just staying neutral, the marketers are like, oh, if you take away this you know, this hate brings in butts in the seats. I want hate.
Yeah.
I think Terry said, you know, the media doesn't care who, you know, whether there's violence or not. They're not the ones even see it as real anyway. So you're like, yeah, let's pump this hate, because now we're going to get media attention, we'll get people in the seats, and we'll be doing our jobs.
Well, and that's, I'm sorry if I'm kind of squinting. My internet connection's slow, so I'm kind of catching the tail end of everything you're saying, but I think I understand what you said. And I think it goes back to something I was going to say after Terry's comment, that
Okay.
Can everyone hear me now?
Hey, well, Cody reboots. I want to come back to Terry for a second and what he was saying as it relates to what Dave was saying. I think, you know, one of the things that I think a lot of these schools have done is they've created this rivalry, or tried to manufacture the term that used this rivalry, but have not put the research behind it, right? Now, I know researchers always say this, hey, we're important because you have to, you know, we're trying to make ourselves important, whatever. But, you know, I think that schools get excited, or teams get excited about the potential for rivalry, and they sort of jump the gun a little bit, right? They, like, create a trophy, and then they, like, try and get a sponsor for it because that's revenue, right? And then they're like, except for UCF and UConn, they get the other school to buy in. They seem to skip that step. And then they're like, okay, it's a rivalry, right? I think that, you know, a better way to go about it is to be more deliberate. Gather the data, find out, you know, where do these antecedents exist, with what opponents do these antecedents exist, right? And then to really get, in the case of college sports, get students and alumni involved in coming up with some of the ideas in terms of maybe a trophy or some rituals around it, right? And I would suggest not even rolling out the series as a rivalry, until you have some of those aspects in place for a year or two, right? Now, I know that that's a long-term perspective, and that's really unpopular because they're concerned with driving revenue now and demand. But if you want it to take off, I think that's the way to go about it, is to put some of the elements in place behind the scenes with a lot of fan involvement, and then see what happens with those elements organically, right? So you're kind of manipulating it, you're kind of manufacturing it, but at the same time, hopefully, you're doing it collaboratively, right, with your fans. And I think players and coaches are extremely important to this, right? Like, I go back to when, who was it, Brady Hoke or Rich Rod? Whenever the Notre Dame series was canceled with Michigan, whoever the Michigan coach was at the time came out in the media in a press conference and said they're afraid to play us. There's no other reason for them not to play us, right? Like, those type of comments, that can spark a rivalry, right? Now, obviously, there was already a rivalry in that case, but if you get a coach or a player with the coach's blessing who's willing to come out and make some semi-controversial statements, I know that some coaches don't want to do that at all because of the locker room potential, but, I mean, that can really, I think, have an effect, and you can, as a marketer, work behind the scenes and talking to your coaches and players and try and, get something like that to happen, I think.
Can everyone hear me?
So I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry,
ahead,
is Cody back?
Yeah, we had a glitch with the system.
Oh, okay. No, you mentioned about the trophies, and I was just thinking, because I quickly pulled up Missouri and Arkansas's history here as an anecdote, because pretty much right away they said, okay, well, now we're rivals, battle line, here's our name, and we're going to make a trophy. And it was introduced, I believe, after the second game in 2015, and they had only played in 2 bowl games in the previous 50 years before 2014 when Missouri came to the SEC. So I wonder if by doing that and making it look so fake from the beginning, does that ultimately turn people off even more? And then, are you hamstringing yourself and setting back any potential for rivalry because you're making it look fake, and people don't buy it for whatever reason. You can't tell us that 2 teams who played 6 times over 100 years are rivals just because we're 4 or 5 hours drive away. And if you try to push that on people too aggressively, do they then back off and say, wait a minute, we're not buying this, we don't agree? I don't know.
We did have a glitch with the system. It showed up that too many people were unmuted or something, and no one was unmuted. I don't know. But to go to just what Terry was saying with Arkansas, Missouri, I actually had someone from the Missouri paper, call me and ask about that. And what we talked about was you have to have fan buy-in, because if it's something that looks like it's manufactured and looks like it's cheesy, fans aren't going to adopt it. And so from a practitioner perspective, if you are trying to manufacture something, you at least have to have stakeholder buy-in, those trendsetters who are going to pass that on to everyone else. And then David, going back to your question, one really good example about, if we lose this negativity, do we lose rivalry and interest? A great example I always give is the University of Nebraska. And when they joined the Big Ten, the Big Ten decided they were going to be rivals with Iowa. And so they created what they call the Heroes game to try to make it a positive experience. And it's positive. Now, I've been to 2 games. It's not to say that there's not negative stuff that goes on there. I've been yelled at plenty times there. But there's this idea that they recognize a citizen from each state at halftime. And so instead of, you have your 2 in-group and out-group, your Iowa fans, Nebraska fans, but then everyone's like a big in-group because they're part of this Heroes game. They did the same thing with Wisconsin, and they created what's called the Freedom Trophy. Again, same thing, trying to create a big in-group. However, possibly the most followed or talked about rivalry is actually between Nebraska and Minnesota. And I don't know if anyone has heard of this, but it's called the $5 Bits of Broken Chair Trophy. And it was started out of a Twitter battle between the Faux Pelini Twitter account and the Golden Gopher Twitter account, and where they kept going back and forth asking what they were going to play for. And Faux Pelini suggested a golden chair, and the Gopher said, as long as I can break it over your head if we win. And Pelini retorted, said, if you break it over my head, I get to make a trophy out of it. That's it. And so now, like, you go and you Google $5 Bits of Broken Chair Trophy, and the organizations are actually starting to adopt it. I mean, you can see pictures with both coaches or teams from both, players from both teams, coaches from both teams holding up this trophy after the game. And so I think it's interesting, going back to you, David, that as marketers or as managers, we can try to responsibly promote this. But the question has to be asked, the organic rivalries, they tend to be negative. And so maybe it is, if we try to be too positive, then we lose some of that interest just in those three examples that I've seen. So I think it's an interesting question. So we're running up against time. Let me go so we can get to the rest. Just real quickly, the third question we had was, how can research in a sport rivalry be improved by using secondary data? And this is something that Terry and I have talked about a lot, that self-report can only tell you so much. But, how do we get access to real consumption data? Or for some of the things that I'm doing, likelihood of consuming your product or wearing merchandise. How do we get access to actual sales from team stores on rivalry game days or things like that, or other ideas of how secondary data can be used to drive our research?
Well, the one thing is that what was it, Sanford and Scott's looking at secondary ticket pricing, and what happens to ticket prices and secondary market, where obviously market forces can have a greater effect when that rival comes to town. That's an obvious one. In terms of sales of products, I don't know where you would get that one.
Has
merchandise products, I mean.
Has anyone else started to look at this and started to look at, instead of self-reporting, we actually have the data that shows people are consuming or doing whatever they're suggesting they would do?
It's not consumption, but in terms of backing up their actions or their words with actions, Brian Mills and Scott Tansky are using the ultimatum game with rival fans.
Okay.
Did anybody see, Cody, you're probably there, their presentation in NASM in Orlando on that?
I think I actually missed that one.
Okay. You may have been, I don't know. Anyway, so for those of you that aren't familiar, the ultimatum game, you say, person A, you get $10. You can give person B however much of that you want, but if they accept your offer, then you both get the money. If they reject it, neither of you get the money. And people would get punished. If you offer somebody $1, in theory they're $1 richer, but they might punish you for being so rude as to only offer them $1. So that's the ultimatum game. And Mills and Tansky have been doing this with rival fans in order to judge just how much do you see that person as a rival, and they are more likely to punish, and therefore spite themselves, they're more likely to punish rival fans as opposed to neutral fans. And while this isn't consumption, it is directly linking actual behavior to, in an experimental mode, to one's perceptions of rivalry.
it's I mean, this is the same issue that we deal with, in sponsorship research and in lots of areas of sport research is trying to get people's actual behaviors and not purchase intention. Um, I mean, I wonder if you could get a relationship with an athletic department or with an organization that they set up a specific merchandise page for rivalry gear, and then you can somehow track purchasing through that and some of their blasts and see who's buying that material and so on. I mean, I'm sure there'd be an interesting experiment somewhere in like that, but I mean, I think this is the same problem that we run up against in a lot of our research, which is purchase intention turning into behavior or actual purchase and theory, plan, behavior, etc.
Hmm. Anyone else?
David, didn't we see somebody use Twitter? Somebody used Twitter as an outcome, like the number of hashtags or something like that. I can't remember who that was, but I know somebody published a paper that used that, which would be secondary data. I thought that was a really good idea, and made note of it. I'm sure I have it saved here and can
Probably an Evernote somewhere. Yeah.
send it to you guys. But because they use all these games use hashtags, right? Rivalry, what we would think of as rivalry games, and also games that are not rivalry games, right? So it gives us, I think that's one of the problems, is that with secondary data is you can't just have the secondary data for rivalry games, you got to have the secondary data for all games, right? So you can then try and identify which might be rivalry games, so you have some variance. TV ratings, obviously, I probably don't even need to say that, but that would be a great data set if we had a full data set to use to measure demand, because you don't have that artificial cap that you have with attendance, right?
Mm-hmm. David, I'll send you the information on that.
Okay.
So you can see it. It's pretty interesting. But
Yeah.
real quick, just because we're up against time, let's real quickly. I think it'd be nice just to go around and future projects or areas of research and rivalry. This could be something that you're working on, you're planning to work on, or just an idea. So if everybody could give one, maybe two, then we could try to wrap things up pretty quickly. So David, do you want to start, and we can kind of go around clockwise?
Sure. Yeah. We are. One thing we're looking at now, or the big thing that's keeping us busy, is with this pro data. As Joe mentioned, we're going to roll that out on No Rivalry shortly, and we're looking at that a bit more. And doing that connection, the paper we were working on this week was looking at that connection that Joe was talking about between the antecedents and the outcomes, and specifically that outcome of Schadenfreude. What's happening? What are the antecedents that are relevant to leading to some of the outcomes that we've looked at? And Joe, do you want to touch on anything else that we have going on?
No, I mean, I think that sums it up pretty much. It's just that connection. We're hoping to go international, so I'm interested to see Cody's stuff when it comes out too, because we can maybe, well, I'm sure we could learn from it, but we can maybe even adapt some of it or use some of it once we don't have any data cleaned. We have some potential data from Australia, but I think that's the direction that we're definitely hoping to go. And then also, I have like a paper that a student started working on that just looks at sort of your likelihood of being identified as a rival based on how good your team is, right? And like how many championships you've won in the past, which is kind of intuitive, but it looks like there might be some surprising stuff in there as well that could make a contribution. So I need to dig into kind of what he did in class and see how that plays itself out.
Cool. We're working on a couple things that we actually have two things we're doing right now where we actually show a quantitative measure of chloride reflective fire, which we're really excited about, and then most recently trying to compare it to Schadenfreude, and because Schadenfreude is, can apply outside of sport and even outside of, we maintain even outside of the rivalry aspect. So someone could just dislike the New York Yankees that doesn't necessarily consider their team a rival of the Yankees and just be happy that the Yankees are losing. And so we're kind of looking at some of the differences between the broad Schadenfreude and then Gorfing, and sort of Gorfing being kind of underneath the Schadenfreude umbrella and just a different aspect of it. But the thing that I'm really excited about now is, and after this weekend, we will have all the data we need, is I briefly mentioned looking at online comments of people watching and commenting on the 3 presidential debates before the election, and how those compare with comments that people make about rivalry games or during rivalry games. And so we used Yahoo Politics to gather information during the political debates, and then we're actually just using the ESPN Gamecast because that's a pretty neutral place for people to comment during a rivalry game. And so we're going through some different measures trying to figure out what rivalry games we're choosing to compare those against. And that really comes from something we did a long time ago. It actually comes from data from the dissertation that long ago that we were able to go through and identify different characteristics and categorize people based on the online comments that they're making, as far as if it's fun, if it's joking, but then if it really is derogatory, and if it rises to the level like some of the comments that Joe showed during his presentation, some of those really, really negative comments. And so I'm really excited about that. It's going to be a lot of work, but getting into comparing how people discuss a sport rivalry and how they discuss these political debates and the political process, and see where there's similarities and differences amongst those. And I'll say one difference we've seen so far is there are exponentially more and longer comments left during the political debates than there have been during any of the rivalry games. It seems like during rivalry games, it's one-off, like this team's horrible, or I don't like this team, or whatever. And during the political debates, people were actually making points, sometimes with citations, trying to change people's opinions, which I always find very interesting as well, that you're never going to be able to do that. So those are two things that we're working on. Johannes, what do you have coming down the pipeline?
1 second, Johannes. First of all, Cody, you're a very brave man for digging into the world of online comments. That is a scary, awful, murky place. But also, I've got to go teach sport marketing and somehow talk about something other than rivalry, even though now all these ideas are going on in my head. So I'm going to jump off. But thank you very much for organizing this. I appreciate it. And it was great seeing you guys. This is a lot of fun. And I'm sure I'll talk to you all offline sometime soon.
Yeah. Thanks, David. Good to see you.
All right, take care.
Take
care. Yeah, one interesting thing which you just said, maybe it's because when I tell people I look into sports rivalries, and they always make the connection to political rivalries, and especially with Trump and Clinton. So a question I got asked a lot of times is, how does this rivalry between the brand communities, how does this, which effect does it have on neutral voters or neutral persons who are not really on one side yet? Do they care about this rivalry? Is it good, or does that influence them at all? How does it influence them? So maybe you can also tie that in and see how, well, not just about the two brand communities, but also the neutral guys, and maybe see what kind of effects it has. But just an idea. What I would love to do is I don't know. I think actually this hate management would be very interesting. You know this. You got anger management in psychology or self-control, but maybe in Rivalry you need some hate management, and it seems to come down to the element of hate, that it is very crucial, and that people somehow desire a bit of hating and bad mouthing and yeah, and it's just like last year. I think I said the same. It's drawing the thin line between the positive and the negative consequences. And I mean, the most interesting part, I think, is this hate, because as Terry and Lamar said, many rivalries are pretty friendly these days. So the athletes get along well. They have a lot of respect for each other. But that's probably not what makes it intriguing for the viewers. So if you can throw in a bit of controversy and animosity, that would be interesting. And yeah, somehow exploring that would be an option. But I haven't really made up my mind and not really started it yet. But maybe at some point in the future.
Yeah, talk about manufacturing a rivalry. There you go, Johannes.
Yeah, if that is exactly.
Lamar, what do you have going on?
As Terry and I spoke about earlier, really want to look more into probably the first portion of our research. Will begin with, just looking at ID as it relates to individual athletes and individual sports, and then, perhaps sometime down the line, looking at, which components, which dimensions or facets of rivalry are really driving not only, favorable, but also, some of the unfavorable outcomes too associated with individual rivalries.
Okay. Do you have anything to add, Terry?
I've been kind of saying this for a while and just, keep getting sidetracked into other things. But I would at some point like to look at, obviously being more of a sponsorship person, I would like to look at brands and sponsors and how they're capitalizing on rivalry. And I think, as we've kind of talked more about this individual sports settings, I think there's more opportunity there because, the awareness aspect just isn't there in team sports for the most part. Even for the most highly identified fan, can they name a single, premier top-end sponsor of their rival team? My guess is that most can't. So that doesn't really lend itself well, I don't think, to sponsorship research, but the individual sport context, I think, does. So I would like to look at that perspective a little more, but nothing defined yet. But after today, I'm kind of getting a little more interested in that again. So maybe before too long, I'll start down that road again.
Terry, there is some cool stuff with NASCAR that
I've seen some of the NASCAR stuff. I know that that's the one place that it's been looked at a little bit, and I'd like to kind of move that maybe in some other directions.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're over time. Thanks everyone for giving your time today and giving your expertise, and thanks everyone for staying overtime, pulling a little longer than we initially said. A couple things to close out. What I'm going to do, I'm going to mix this recording, and I'm going to try to have it up very soon. Like I said, I'm going to put it on sportrivalry.com, but we can also, if you want to put it on No Rivalry, Joe, or whatever anybody wants to do with it. I do have
I'll
someone.
try and get that up.
Okay, thanks. I have someone doing a quick summary of this as well, so you all can see that. And then Joe and Johannes, if you could send me your PowerPoints, just in case the recording somehow didn't pick it up, that I can kind of add those into when I make the iMovie for the recording. And then finally, I've spoken to all of you individually, but remember that the SMQ special issue on Rivalry, the deadline is the 30th. So the way that's going to work, I've spoken with Steven Shapiro, is when you submit, you just you have the option to say that it's going toward a special issue, and that's all you'll have to do to make sure that it's sent for the special issue. And then, so other than that, if no one has any other questions or comments, I thank everyone. It was another great discussion. I look forward to doing it next year again, and getting some more great ideas and just general discussion on it. So, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cody.
Thank you, Cody.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
guys. We'll see you.
Yeah.
See ya.
Have a good holiday and have a good rivalry week.
See ya.
Bye.
See you.
You too.